Welcome to the part one of our webinar series, Critical COVID Conversations, where we will be discussing the impact of the global pandemic that it has had on ventilator testing. That is the topic for today. My name is Katya, and I'm a product manager at Fluke Biomedical. Be facilitating today's discussion. Today we will hear from Jerry Zion, our global training manager at Fluke Biomedical, who has over 40 years of experience in the biomedical field. He's our absolute expert in anything that is related to medical device quality assurance. We will also hear from Michael Rach, our business unit leader, who holds a deep expertise in gas flow equipment specifically. Prior to this role, he actually launched and managed our VT gas flow analyzer product line. Hello, Jerry. Hello, Michael, and thank you very much for being here today.
Hi, thanks everyone for joining.
Good morning.
Morning. So before we begin, actually, I want to give a little information on the huge benefit of attending today's event. Since last year, you're able to receive CI credits for watching our Empower webinar series, a series of educational webinars by Fluke Biomedical. It includes this webinar today. In the Empower series, we all sorts of topics that you may be interested in as a biomedical professional. We share our best practices, expert knowledge, and of course, we hear all of the questions that you may have for us. If you would like to watch any of the Empower webinars that we have produced today and receive credit for them, you can go to flukemedical.com, click on knowledge, and click on webinars. Everything is available there, everything absolutely free. You can share them with your colleagues, with your friends, and recording of today's webinar will also be available on that page. If you go to flukemedical.com, Knowledge Center and webinars, you will find all there. Again, quick information on how to get credit for today's event. Very simple steps that you need to take to get that credit. First thing, you need to attend the event itself. That really takes about 30-40 minutes, so you need to listen to everything up to the Q&A. We always encourage you to stay through the Q&A as well, as we get a lot of really great questions there. But then again, it is not going to affect your credit if you don't. Next step will be one webinar over. You will receive an email from Fluke Biomedical with a survey. The email will come to you within about 24 hours after the event. Please watch out for that email. The link in that email will be available to you for about 72 hours, or about 3 days after the event. Please access the link within that time frame, because the link will expire and you have to watch once again to receive credit. The third step is that once you have the survey, the certificate will be in front of you and you will be able to download it. It's very helpful. With that, let's begin today's event. In the next hour, we will be discussing the following. We will talk about the impact of the pandemic, the ventilator market and its different players. We will talk about the shifts that we saw in the needs of those players and how our experts here at Fluke Biomedical recommend to approach them, where to begin. With that, the floor to you, Jerry.
Thanks, Katya. You can get advanced. There you go. Let's talk a little bit about how the COVID-19 pandemic, why it affected the need for ventilator testing and more ventilators. It really began with the realization clinically that the patients had difficulty breathing, especially those that were more dramatically affected by the virus than others. And so the breathing that they needed, the assistance in breathing, called for them to be put on ventilators, sometimes with just a mask on their face. Other times they needed intubation, which would have increased the length of time that they needed ventilation. So the more people that were dramatically affected by this virus, the more patients who needed ventilators and therefore hospitalization. And that really drove demand and the really big need for not only, let's say, if we just looked at the United States and Western Europe, we already had a pretty good supply chain in place and lots of ventilators that we could produce. But even we here had to increase production. In other parts of the world, there were no ventilator producers, and sometimes at all, or sometimes they were very small companies, and they had to ramp. They had to actually create ventilator designs or medical devices that could assist appropriately the breathing of the patient, because as it turned out, too deep, too powerful an assistance actually made the problem in the lungs worse and and allowed damage to happen due to the virus. So all while the doctors were figuring all of this out, we had to increase dramatically this availability of ventilators and intensive care capability. Mike, you want to elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, no, thanks for that lead in. Because that demand, it wasn't only felt by those medical device manufacturers. It was also felt by new companies that weren't even in the medical space. They had to step up and design new product in many cases, and try and get those to market. Ultimately, the goal was that the product needed to reach the hospital in order to treat all these patients with the conditions that Jerry explained. And when they reached the hospital, this put, an intensified demand on the service staff, the biomedical technicians, to service these medical devices as well. So one thing to think about as we get into today's discussion, no matter which company you worked in or which industry you worked in, all these companies came to Fluke Biomedical as thought leaders in the space, and it was our job, or we saw it as our job, to ensure that they got their test equipment in a timely manner. The end goal for us in this entire pandemic was to make sure that we were continuing to ensure patient and operator safety in this time of intense critical need.
So why did we need the global manufacturing to ramp? I've already discussed this a little bit about USA and Western Europe. We already had a pretty good supply chain, but we needed to ramp production of the ventilator itself. And that caused the manufacturers, the designer and developer of these ventilators, to need more capacity to produce these bigger production lines. And they didn't always have the space within their own company or their facilities to do that. So they had to outsource and bring other people, other companies in to help them assemble and do final assembly testing. So that caused new players. In some cases, and Mike will elaborate on this, it caused the players that may never have actually produced a ventilator before to have to step up. And many of them were very, very willing to do that. In some cases, kinds of businesses that you wouldn't normally expect to be building ventilators.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, the spike was greater than what these medical device OEMs could even keep up with. So they had to call in people, other companies outside of the medical device space to supplement their manufacturing need. And where we saw those companies come from was all over the place, but primarily from the automotive and aerospace industries. They stepped in really quickly, and they transitioned some of their operations to manufacturing ventilators for these OEMs. So you were seeing OEM branded product come off of production lines from these automotive and aerospace manufacturers. This kind of came to be in a few different ways. In the US, they used the Defense Production Act, the DPA, and it called on these adjacent industries to help. And then in the UK, there was also the UK Challenge that achieved a similar effect. And that's how these companies from different industries, automotive, aerospace, and others, came into the medical device manufacturing space and worked with these medical device manufacturers to deliver product to the hospitals and then to these patients that were in need. So in order to support these manufacturers, these new manufacturers, we, Fluke Biomedical, needed to react to the spike in demand that this created for us. Our VT gas flow analyzers were being called on to play a really critical role in ventilator production, and we needed to ensure that we were getting our product out to these OEMs in their time of need. Because of course, this created a shock on our supply chain. So we did all that we could to ensure that our supply chain was unbroken and that we could produce units at a high rate. So what we did was we brought in additional tests and manufacturing benches to be able to raise our throughput to be able to keep up with the demand we were seeing. And frankly, at the end of it, I'm really proud of what the team was able to do. We're proud to have played a really large role in the manufacturing of these ventilators, tens of thousands. And although it took a great deal of hustle, we're really happy with the output and what we were able to do during the pandemic.
So as I've talked already about in the USA and Western Europe, if we compare that to what was happening in the rest of the world, there was actually a very heroic response and wonderful, I'll call it entrepreneurship. Young engineers and others that in countries where they didn't have easy, quick, or financially reasonable access to additional ventilators and other medical devices. And Mike will talk about that later. And what happened there is new ventilator designs, mostly at a rather basic level for ventilation, sometimes little more than a mechanical hand on a squeezing a breathing bag like an anesthesiologist or a paramedic might do in an emergency situation or during surgery. And that new design development needed help in terms of not only test equipment to be used during those stages of development, but also training and learning about what it means to create a life support device like a ventilator.
Yeah, and like you said, it really did become kind of a race. So companies and universities from all over the world were trying to design these new types of ventilators. And like you said, Jerry, some of them were fully featured, or everything that you'd expect in the modern ventilator, to very basic. And what they were trying to get to, at least in the U.S., was something called an emergency use authorization, an EUA, from the Food and Drug Administration. And this basically gave them the permission, in the case of an emergency, to use it in the field. That's what they were trying to do in the U.S., was bring a design to market and be able to help during this pandemic. And these people did reach out to us as well. They reached out to us for a few different reasons. One reason is they looked to us because they needed test equipment. They were using our gas flow analyzers on their test benches to perform validation and verification, V&V, of their designs in order to bring them to market to make sure that their designs were working as intended. Another reason they reached out to us was for guidance and education. We were on calls, multiple times with designers, and we provided some advice to them on the use of our tools, how they should measure certain parameters given their design, and we really helped partner with them and helped troubleshoot them through the process. And a lot of customers found this really helpful, and we really were able to help them accelerate their progress towards getting that EUA. And then the third reason that they reached out to us was actually for innovation. Necessity is the mother of invention, and COVID was no exception here. These firms were looking to do things in a little bit of a different way, and our engineering team, kudos to them, was able to act very quickly and add some features to our VTs, one of which was the ability to stream test data at a very high rate. Some customers were asking for that, and we were able to turn that around quickly and support these customers. No small feat on the part of the engineering team, and a big thank you to them for everything we were able to bring to market in a very short period of time to try and help as much as we can.
So so now we have a poll question. Katya, you want to introduce this?
Yeah, absolutely. As we were thinking, about all of these emerging, manufacturers of ventilators, we got a lot of feedback from different parts of the world, but we thought it would be interesting to see what you have experienced in the field and whether or not you have seen those new ventilator designs from, not just the OEMs that were working really hard to get, more ventilators to the market, but also from the non-traditional ventilator manufacturers. So we were just curious, we're going to open this poll up in just a second. Dan, if you could help us do so. All right, so you should be able to see the poll question here, and we just really appreciate your feedback, and we're curious to see whether you have seen any of those new ventilator designs. We're going to keep it open for a few seconds to give everyone an opportunity to respond.
Yeah, this will be an interesting one. There was definitely a flurry of activity. Curious to see if they get out there, and we've seen some.
Mm-hmm.
And Dan, I think I'm going to look at you to announce the results of the poll. I do not seem to have the access to it.
Okay, we'll go ahead and close the poll, and I'll go ahead and share it. So it looks like 63% have not seen the new design.
But over a third of our audience today actually have. That's actually really, really interesting. Yeah, and we can have a larger discussion on that in the Q&A. So if you do not mind, please share your feedback with us via the questions tab and go to webinars so we could discuss it later.
Yeah, let us know which ones you've seen. I think that would be really interesting to see.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, so along with all of this increase in production and increase in need in medical facilities around the world, let's just focus back in for a minute on how these ventilators that were just produced, just shipped, just delivered to the medical facility, what kind of additional testing needs happened. And it actually began back in the factory where these ventilators were being developed. So there was the design validation testing, and there was also final assembly testing in the production line, because that's the first time that all the pieces parts were put together into a supposedly ready for use ventilator that could then be shipped out to the hospital. And at that point, the hospital needed to carry on and do some additional testing. Incoming inspections was really a critical thing to do. Trust but verify. And especially where you had a non-traditional manufacturer delivering a product, a ventilator that you had not seen before, that needed to be run through some paces before you put it into clinical use. The field service teams needed to increase. I hadn't heard anything about new installation activity from the medical device manufacturer's field service, but it certainly increased the need. And the more use hours per ventilator, the use hours are often a determinant of when scheduled maintenance needs to be done, as opposed to a calendar schedule. So all of that tend to put a big increase on the requirement and the demand for doing testing beyond just what you normally might have done. Mike, you have more to add for that?
Well, yeah, I mean, in order to do any of that testing you just described, HTM professionals needed tools, right? And that's, this is our primary market, you guys, the biomeds. And one way we supported was through donations, first and foremost. We were able to donate some gas flow analyzers to local Seattle area hospitals, since we're based here in Everett, Washington, and we wanted to help our local community. That was one way we helped. Another was by ensuring that the strength of our supply chain that I touched on before, that our supply chain and production cells was strong, and we were able to get product out into the market in a timely manner. This was critical since everyone ordered at the same time. So getting it out to the hospital was key here. And the last way we helped was through customer education. One thing you might have seen is that we increased the number of webinars that we did last year to ensure that we were educating all of our customers on the importance of testing medical devices. And that was key to making sure that everyone knew what they were doing, why they were doing it, and how to do it. And specifically on medical devices used in the intensive care unit, the ICU or the critical care unit. So understanding why it's important, what can go wrong, answering any questions, and highlighting best practices. All of these things help their customers to be more successful, as you guys were called on to do more. I think last year was a really big year for Biomed to step up and play a huge role. And on the topic of answering questions, we quickly came out with a COVID application page, and many of you guys might have visited that. And the goal with that was to answer some of those key questions that came up continually at the beginning of the pandemic. How do we disinfect, right? How do I limit the need to disinfect or decontaminate? How can I be more efficient in my testing since I have more to do? The list goes on and on, but it was important for us to get those answers out to our customers. And it wasn't just content development. We also did work on the production side, the development side. So we did talk about some of those updates we did for some of those ventilator designers. But we also sped up the release of our VT workflow automation software, 1QA. And we were actually able to release that in December 2020. And if you're not familiar, this software allows biomeds to standardize their test procedures, which in turn reduces risk and ensures compliance. The kicker is it takes the Fluke Biomedical VT, which is already really easy to run tests on, and it automates it. And this can reduce your testing time by controlling the test device to execute procedures, auto-populating the test results, and creating a test report, which can be uploaded into your CMMS. Ultimately, through this whole thing, the goal was to get tools to people that needed them to help them ensure patient safety as effectively as possible. That was what we really tried to do last year.
And I want to quickly go back to the point that you, Michael, made a minute ago about the need for education, because one of the most asked questions that we got pretty much the entire year last year was on, for example, whether you can connect multiple patients to one ventilator. And that question actually came from biomeds, which was really, really curious to us. And, as we were thinking about it, we realized that the biomeds all over the world, they just saw that increased need to dive deeper into the ventilator use and the clinical application behind it, which is why we realized that it was absolutely important for us to hold more of those educational events and actually talk more about the mechanics of the ventilator and kind of like the physical aspects of its use, and provide help to biomeds to help them quickly ramp up their knowledge on, again, what Michael said on what they do and why they're doing it, which was really interesting.
So Jerry, you want to take a stab at that question, since it gets asked so often?
Can you connect more than one patient? Well, that one in particular is really a question for the pulmonologist, the doctor who specializes in and orders the treatment using a ventilator. But we tried to help people understand that ventilators are designed, their intended use is for a single patient, and they always have been. And this idea of can you connect more than one patient to a single ventilator was driven by the extremely urgent demand for more ventilators than were available. And so the doctors and nurses and even the biomeds, they were asking the biomeds, and biomeds said, hey, we don't know. The answer is, realistically, if you had more than one patient you were going to connect to a ventilator, they had better have the same treatment plan as each other. So 1, 2, 3, however many there are. And the ventilator's intended use never covered that. So now you're out in territory about effective delivery that you've never been before, the doctors and nurses have never been before. And so it required additional clinical monitoring, which increased the need for other things than just ventilators in order to make the treatment work. So Mike, you want to talk a little bit about the rest of what we saw?
Yeah, I mean, if that's one specific use case, and there were lots of questions, so I'll hold off till the end to see what questions do come in.
Okay.
But I think what's key here, and maybe I'll just segue to this slide, which is an image of what you might see in an intensive care unit or a critical care unit from medical device perspective. So likely you'll see a ventilator, a patient monitor, and an infusion pump. And what's in the center there is the patient. And all of these devices are critical to the diagnosis and the treatment of a COVID patient. And all of these devices need to function properly. So one thing to note is that all of the medical devices displayed here are powered by electricity. So in order to ensure that these medical devices are safe to use for both staff and patients, electrical safety testing needs to be performed. Once that's done, the second portion of testing is functional testing. Functional testing ensures that the patient monitor is displaying the right readings, the infusion pump is infusing the right volumes, and the ventilator is delivering the right flow, pressure, and volume. There are, of course, more that each of these medical devices does, but it's critical that each one of these devices perform those functions as designed for the next patient. That's the intent here, and with the increased use, it became, all the more important. One thing I do want to note while we're at the high level here, on a side note, we held webinars on how to test each of these medical devices last year. So if you are interested in some of those key questions, best practices, or the clinical use, please do go to our webinar archive to learn more.
Yeah, so all of those webinars are, again, available on demand. You can watch them at any time, refresh your knowledge. If you want to, everything is available to you for free. And yeah, so please go to flukebiomedical.com, click on Knowledge Center, click on webinars, and you can watch all of that. I will switch to the next slides where Jerry will let us know more about, more of the educational materials that we have available for you.
Yeah, so as you might understand, we're sitting here in the West Coast of the United States, but the requirements and the needs were global in nature, worldwide. So how in the world do we possibly help make sure that education and training around the concept of what is medical device quality assurance, and more specifically around each of the categories of medical devices that you saw in the previous slide, how would we possibly ramp up and be able to help people that way? Well, we already had, and we're well prepared with our content in our Advantage Training Center within our medical device quality assurance course series and within our Introduction to Using course series, which is about use of any of the test instruments that we make. And beginning at every time with the clinical need and the intended use of the medical device, and then about where the requirements for testing come. So our Advantage Training Center is where you find these academic style courses that have a course quiz. Once you pass the course quiz, you get a different kind of certificate, a certificate of completion. And in our Advantage Training Center learning management system, we keep track of all of the training that you do. And guess what? This is also free. So you don't pay anything because you've already invested or are investing in test instruments that we make. We want to make sure you never fail in your ability to use them correctly and effectively.
So back at the beginning, we touched on those three buckets of customer types, and I do want to revisit them. So one was ventilator manufacturing, one was ventilator design, specifically new design, and the other was ventilator service. And because each one of these customers appears different on the surface, you might think that they're all doing something drastically different from one another. But essentially, they're all seeking to perform the same task, just at different points in time. So the design engineer, right, he or she is trying to ensure that his design meets the regulatory requirements, right? That's one thing to note. The manufacturing engineer, they're trying to ensure that the product meets their design intent and performance before they ship it off to a customer. And then the biomed at the hospital is trying to ensure that the product still meets all of those requirements that are listed in the service manual. One thing to note here is that the service manual is really just a subset of the requirements in the larger regulation. So essentially, each one of these personas is testing to the regulations, just at different points or for different, never for a different reason, right? Other than compliance.
Right. It's all about are they safe and effective for clinical use, and do they stay that way? And the international standards are a really good place, which is why we always start there when we're talking about how you use our test instruments, because it's critical in each of these different areas. The number of test points, test settings that need to be evaluated may be more or fewer, depending on which part of the process that you're in. They may need to be repeated because you find that what you thought was going to work maybe doesn't work quite the way that you intended it to. And in manufacturing, as we said before, it's the first time that all of the pieces parts have been put together into a complete medical device that can and must then be tested to make sure that it's safe and effective before it ships out to the customer or the end user. Biomeds, you all know how important it is to carry out the testing on a scheduled maintenance or periodic basis. And as we said before, in terms of the ventilator, it may be based on the use hours of that ventilator and not just on a calendar periodicity. So all of these things were important, and the standards actually helped. As Mike said, the test procedure in the service manual for a particular medical device, in this case ventilators, is the manufacturers communicating to all of us who are going to do testing beyond once we receive their design, their product, to ensure that the testing is done has been tailored to the design of that particular device, brand and model specific. And yes, it has to comply with the international standards, and the testing limits that are given to you and the service manual test procedure all come from and adhere to, comply with the testing limits from the international standard. So even if you were in a country that didn't have local national standards, you could easily lean on and use the international standards and the service manual procedures to move forward. And that helped as we teach, because we teach that way, it helped the manufacturers and designers, and it also helped you as biomeds. And we're very happy to be able to do that and want to continue to do that to help you always be able to be successful.
Yeah, and one way to think about it is the source of the information is always the same. It's always the standard. It almost just gets filtered depending on the task at hand. So it might just get titled as something else and have a different amount of test points or a different procedure, be it a validation plan or a final assembly test or a checkout procedure. Those are all derived from the same exact place, but it's just different formatting, right, to show you the relevant tasks for you to perform for whatever job or role you find yourself in.
Yep.
All right, so thank you very much, Jerry and Michael. I think with that we are over the main presentation that we had for our audience today.